The New Year's Eve was anticipated to be a warm, family-focused celebration. However, upon her mother's arrival at her daughter's apartment, a peculiar scene unfolded. At the festive table sat only the son-in-law and his relatives. The beloved daughter and grandchildren were nowhere to be seen. "Where are my daughter and grandchildren?" the mother asked, bewildered. "I sent them all away. My mother can't stand them," the husband declared with a proud grin. "Greetings, dear listeners. I'm delighted to welcome you to my channel. I have a new, intriguing story for you. Please enjoy." Irina Lvovna, a woman with 30 years of teaching experience, always prided herself on her impeccable upbringing. She possessed remarkable self-control, even when tempted to hurl a grade book at a particularly insolent ninth grader. Upon her retirement, she finally had the opportunity to devote more time to her daughter and grandchildren. Polina had reached the age of 30. Her son, 6-year-old Timofey, and 3-year-old Liza were growing up. The little ones were the absolute center of Irina Lvovna's world, especially after the passing of her husband 3 years prior. Her relationship with her son-in-law Edward had been stable. He worked as a manager for a construction firm, earning approximately 120,000, a respectable sum, in their provincial city. Polina also worked as an accountant at the same company, her 65,000 contributing significantly to the household income. They had purchased a 3-room apartment in a new building on the outskirts and were handling renovations themselves. Irina Lvovna frequently visited to offer assistance, whether it was cooking borscht or watching the children while the parents tackled tiling or wallpapering. Difficulties began 2 years ago when Polina's mother-in-law, Lyudmila Fyodorovna, was widowed and began to actively intrude upon the young couple's lives. Previously, she had lived in a neighboring district with her husband, a former military officer, and hadn't been overly bothersome. Now, alone in her one-room Khrushchev-era apartment, she seemed to have been unleashed. She would call Edward 10 times a day, demanding attention, money, and assistance. Irina Lvovna learned of this piecemeal through Polina's tearful phone calls. Initially, Lyudmila Fyodorovna would simply drop by on weekends without invitation. Then, she began criticizing Polina's cooking, housekeeping, and child-rearing. Edward remained silent, pretending nothing was amiss. If Polina dared to object, he would hiss, "Don't you dare be rude to my mother. She's going through grief. She needs support." "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore," Polina lamented during one of Irina Lvovna's visits. They sat in the kitchen while the children watched cartoons in the other room. "She showed up yesterday at 8 in the evening, just as I had put Liza to bed. She started complaining that no one loved her, that her son had forgotten her. Edith rushed to comfort her, waking up our daughter. Liza then couldn't sleep until midnight. Today, she's been fussy all day." "Talk to Edward seriously," Irina Lvovna advised. "Explain that this is unacceptable, that you have your own family, your own boundaries." "I tried, but he thinks I'm heartless," Polina said. "His mother is alone, and I'm selfish." Irina Lvovna remained silent, but anger simmered within her. She saw how exhausted her daughter was. Work, children, the house, and on top of it all, this mother-in-law with her endless demands. Polina had lost weight. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and she had become nervous and irritable. In the spring, the situation escalated. Lyudmila Fyodorovna declared she could no longer live alone in her apartment, that the memories were too painful. She hinted that it would be beneficial for her to move in with the children. After all, they had 3 rooms, ample space for everyone. Edward enthusiastically embraced the idea, but Polina adamantly refused, leading to a furious argument. "My mother is more important than your whims," Edward bellowed. "If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have married you at all. She said from the very beginning that you weren't right for me." Polina then gathered the children and went to stay with her mother for 3 days. Edward called, apologized, and swore it wouldn't happen again. Irina Lvovna persuaded her daughter to return, though an inner voice screamed that she should flee this mama's boy as far as possible. But where to flee? With 2 children, Polina's salary barely covered their expenses, and renting an apartment was out of the question. Lyudmila Fyodorovna, realizing her move-in plan had failed, changed tactics. She began visiting on weekdays while Polina was at work and proceeded to redecorate the apartment. She moved things, discarded items she deemed unnecessary, and cooked according to her own recipes. Polina would return home and not recognize her own kitchen. Children's toys were packed away in boxes to avoid clutter. Polina's favorite mug had disappeared into the trash bin, deemed old and chipped, merely taking up space. "Mom, I'm going insane," Polina whispered into the phone. "I come home and feel like a guest. Edic says his mother is trying to help, and I'm ungrateful." "Let her help in her own apartment," Irina Lvovna responded sharply. "Polina, you must draw a line. This is your home." But Polina was afraid. She feared losing her family, feared she couldn't manage alone, feared traumatizing the children. She tried to endure, but with each passing day, she felt something inside her breaking. The incident with Timofey occurred in the summer. The boy returned from kindergarten upset, recounting how Grandma Lyuda had taken his tablet, stating he played on it too much. The tablet was a gift from Irina Lvovna for his 6th birthday. Polina herself had installed educational programs and monitored his playtime. However, Lyudmila Fyodorovna had her own ideas. When Polina requested the tablet's return, her mother-in-law threw a tantrum, claiming disrespect and alleging that her good intentions were being insulted. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Edward roared at his wife. "Mother is right. The child is ruining his eyesight. You don't know how to raise children at all." Polina couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her bag, took the children, and went to her mother's, staying for a week. Edward apologized again. The tablet was returned, but the resentment lingered. Irina Lvovna saw how her daughter was changing. Polina became quiet, withdrawn, as if something inside her had extinguished. Meanwhile, Lyudmila Fyodorovna grew increasingly brazen with each visit. She no longer asked for money, but demanded it for medication, renovations, and a new fur coat. Edward dutifully paid, even when they were struggling financially themselves. Polina tried to protest, only to be accused of being heartless. In the fall, a major scandal erupted. Lyudmila Fyodorovna announced her desire to celebrate New Year's at the young couple's apartment, citing her own place as too small and inconvenient. Edward immediately agreed. Polina objected, as they had planned to celebrate with the children and then visit Irina Lvovna. However, Edward was adamant. "We will celebrate with my family," he declared. "If your mother wants to see you, she can visit us, but the main table will be for my mother." Polina attempted to argue, but Edward's voice escalated into a shout. He accused her of turning the children against Grandma Lyuda and driving a wedge between him and his mother. Polina burst into tears and locked herself in the bathroom. Irina Lvovna, upon hearing this over the phone, barely refrained from rushing over to give the mama's boy a piece of her mind, but her daughter pleaded with her not to intervene. "Mom, I'll handle it myself," Polina said wearily. "Just come over on the 31st in the evening. I'll give you the gifts for the children. We'll at least see each other a little." Irina Lvovna agreed, though her heart was heavy with anxiety. On December 31st, she drove across the entire city with a large box of presents. For Timofey, a Lego set he had long dreamed of. For Liza, an interactive doll. There were also sweets, fruits, a bottle of fine wine for her son-in-law, and perfume for her daughter. Irina Lvovna had spent almost her entire pension, but she didn't regret it. The most important thing was for her grandchildren to be happy. She arrived at the apartment building around 9 o'clock in the evening. Polina's 5th-floor apartment windows were illuminated, silhouettes visible through the sheer curtains. Irina Lvovna took the elevator, rang the doorbell. Edward opened it, dressed in a festive shirt, slightly tipsy. His face was smug, his cheeks flushed. Voices, laughter, and the clinking of glasses could be heard from inside. "Ah, Irina Lvovna," he drawled, his voice slurred. Come in, come in." She stepped across the threshold, removed her coat. The hallway smelled of tangerines and herring under a fur coat. Irina Lvovna walked into the living room, box in hand, and froze. About 8 people were seated at the table. Lyudmila Fyodorovna was at the head, with Edward beside her. Then came his cousins with their wives, and some aunt in a crimson sweater. They were all eating, drinking, and laughing. The television blared at full volume. The table groaned under the weight of salads, cold cuts, and hot dishes. But Polina was absent. Timofey was absent, and Liza was absent too. "Where are my daughter and grandchildren?" Irina Lvovna exclaimed. Lyudmila Fyodorovna turned to her, dabbed her lips with a napkin, and offered a venomous smile. Edward leaned back in his chair, squinting with satisfaction. "I sent them all away," he announced loudly, with pride. "My mother can't stand them." Lyudmila Fyodorovna nodded like a bobblehead. "Finally, there's order in the house," she declared in a sweet voice, "without all that whining and complaining." "Thank my son for coming to his senses." The cousins snickered. The woman in crimson giggled. Someone clinked glasses. Irina Lvovna stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the gift box, and stared at the gathering. Something inside her snapped. For 30 years, she had taught children kindness, fairness, and respect. For 30 years, she had controlled herself, swallowed insults, and resolved conflicts with words. But now, before her, sat not people, but boorish, vile creatures who had driven her daughter and grandchildren out into the cold on New Year's Eve. She slowly placed the box on the floor, removed her shoes, low-heeled and stable. "Irina Lvovna, what are you doing?" Edward began, but she wasn't listening. Lyudmila Fyodorovna sat facing away from her, still smiling smugly. Irina Lvovna approached, grasped her by the shoulder, and sharply spun her around. The mother-in-law yelped in surprise. "How dare you?" she began, but didn't finish. Irina Lvovna swung her arm and slapped her so hard that she fell from her chair onto the floor. The woman in crimson shrieked. The cousins jumped up. Edward roared, "Are you completely insane?" He tried to stand, but Irina Lvovna was faster. She turned and struck him across the face with the back of her hand. The blow was so powerful that Edward staggered back, tripped over a chair leg, and crashed down, pulling the tablecloth with him. Salads, cold cuts, and glasses flew onto the floor. Herring under a fur coat splattered across the carpet. Lyudmila Fyodorovna attempted to get up, clinging to the edge of the table, but Irina Lvovna grabbed her by the collar of her blouse and dragged her toward the door. The mother-in-law kicked her legs, shrieked, and scratched, but Irina Lvovna was taller and much stronger. "Let me go, I'll call the police," Lyudmila Fyodorovna wailed. "Get out of here, you wretch!" Irina Lvovna bellowed and kicked the mother-in-law into the hallway. She slammed into the wall, slid to the floor, and howled. By this time, Edward had recovered, jumped up, and lunged at Irina Lvovna. She met him with a punch to the solar plexus, not hard, but enough to make him double over. Then she grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and dragged him after his mother. "How dare you kick out my daughter and grandchildren?" she hissed, dragging him down the hallway. "You damn mama's boy! You spineless weakling!" The cousins tried to intervene, but Irina Lvovna glanced at them with such an expression that they froze. There was so much fury in her eyes that even the drunken men became scared. She dragged Edward to the doorway, where the sobbing Lyudmila Fyodorovna was already sitting, and shoved him. He tumbled down, knocking his mother over. Both collapsed on the landing in a tangle of limbs. "And don't let me see any trace of you here again!" Irina Lvovna roared and slammed the door. Silence descended upon the apartment. The guests sat at the ransacked table, dumbfounded. The woman in crimson trembled, her hand pressed to her mouth. One of the cousins muttered, "Perhaps it's time for us to leave." "Get out!" Irina Lvovna curtly commanded. Within 2 minutes, the apartment was empty. They fled, pulling on their jackets as they went, not looking back. Irina Lvovna leaned her back against the door, breathing heavily. Her hands trembled, her heart pounded. She couldn't believe what she had just done. She, an educated person, a teacher, had laid hands on people, but there was not a trace of remorse, only a feeling of wild satisfaction. She picked up the gift box, walked into the room, took out her phone, and called her daughter. "Polina! Where are you, Mom?" Her daughter's voice was hoarse and tearful. "We're sitting in a cafe at the train station. Edith kicked us out after lunch, told us to get out before the guests arrived. Liza is crying. She wants to go home. I don't know what to do." "Come home immediately," Irina Lvovna said firmly. "I'm waiting for you. But Edик won't be here and won't be coming. Come, I'll explain. 40 minutes later, Polina with the children entered the apartment. Liza was sobbing. Timofey was sullen and red-faced from tears. Polina looked like a wrung-out rag in an old down jacket, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes exhausted. She stopped at the threshold, surveying the chaotic living room. Overturned chairs, food stains on the carpet, scattered shards of glasses. Mom, what happened here? What should have happened a long time ago? Irina Lvovna replied. Go wash up, change. We'll celebrate New Year's. Right. They cleaned the apartment, prepared new salads from what remained in the refrigerator. Irina Lvovna brought out the gifts for the children. Timofey and Liza cheered up, laughed, and began assembling the Lego. At 11 o'clock, they sat down at the table, just the four of them. Polina tried to pry for details, but Irina Lvovna waved her off. Later, later, for now, just be happy that you're together. Edward called around 1 in the morning. His voice was drunk and angry. Have you completely lost your mind? Mother is in the hospital. She has a concussion. I'm suing you. You'll go to jail for this. Irina Lvovna took the phone from her daughter and calmly replied, Sue me, but I'll sue you too, for kicking your wife and young children out into the freezing cold on New Year's Eve. The child welfare authorities will be very interested, and I'll also mention how your mother tormented Polina for 2 years. There will be plenty of witnesses. This is my apartment, Edward yelled. Co-owned, Polina corrected icily. I am an equal owner. If you set foot here, I'll call the police for trespassing. So think about it. She hung up the phone. Polina looked at her with amazement. Mom, it's over, daughter. It's all over. Tomorrow we'll go to a lawyer. You'll file for divorce. Move in with me while you sort out the apartment. You deserve a normal life. Polina began to cry, but these were different tears now. Tears of relief, of liberation. 2 years later, Polina sat in the kitchen of her new 2-bedroom apartment and gazed out the window. Snowflakes swirled outside. Laughter emanated from the children's room. Timofey was telling his sister something. Liza was giggling. Soon her mother would arrive from the neighboring building, bringing the apple pie she had promised. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. The apartment was sold. The proceeds were enough for the down payment on this 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood. Lyudmila Fyodorovna attempted to sue for assault, but the case fell apart. The witnesses from that New Year's Eve suddenly saw and remembered nothing. However, Polina had found neighbors who testified to how her mother-in-law had tormented her and how Edward would yell at night, how the children were kicked out onto the stairs. Polina changed jobs, finding employment with a large company. Her salary nearly doubled. The children started at a new school and kindergarten, making new friends. Irina Lvovna sold her 1-bedroom apartment and moved into the adjacent building to be close by, without interfering. Polina encountered Edward once at a shopping center. He had aged, looked gaunt, and seemed to look past her as if he didn't recognize her. Rumor had it he had married a quiet girl whom Lyudmila Fyodorovna treated like a servant. But for Polina, things had worked out. The doorbell rang. Polina opened it. Irina Lvovna stood at the threshold with a pie dusted with snow. The grandchildren are home, of course. Come in, Mom. They entered the kitchen. Timofey and Liza rushed in, clinging to their grandmother. Irina Lvovna smiled, placed the pie on the table, and brushed the snow from her hair. Well, she said, taking a thermos from her bag. Shall we drink tea or stand around? Polina laughed and reached for the cups. The children were already reaching for the pie. Outside, dusk was gathering, but the kitchen was warm and bright. Everything was finally good.